hope it goes without saying, really, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Charles Bernstein to Dublin, to Ireland, and particularly to UCD. He is, as many of you will know, a distinguished academic who holds the Donald T. Regan Chair at UPenn. Do you still have that?
Emeritus as of July 1st.
Okay. Yeah. And was David Gray Professor of Poetry at Buffalo. But just to say that I think Charles Bernstein has published more books of poetry than I can accurately count, 18 according to Wikipedia, which might or might not be accurate, including All the Whiskey in Heaven, and most recently Near/Miss, which I've been reading with enormous pleasure, and which I'll say a little bit about in a minute or two. So Charles Bernstein has been extraordinarily active as a writer, also as a writer of poetics, and has written or edited a range of monographs and essay collections that I think make a very significant contribution to our understanding of modern poetry. He has also, I think very importantly, played a major part in improving the accessibility of poetry through, for example, his work in Poetics at Buffalo and its early email discussion list. Those things were really important, I think, in their time in terms of bringing people together and bringing ideas together. And also now through the living archive of poetry at Pen Sound, which if you haven't seen, I recommend you go to. And that brings together materials that would otherwise be difficult to access. So he takes poetry into the public. I also know, because I have actually been at 2 or 3 different events with Charles Bernstein, he contributes with an extraordinary generosity to conversations about poetry at conferences and symposia such as this. He wasn't the type of keynote speaker who swept in and out, but in my experience stayed around to talk to people and to get to know them, and exhibited an endless curiosity. He was, as you may know, and as the information about this event indicated, one of the founders of language poetry, a movement that changed the face of American poetry, and one that touched my own life in different ways. I remember being in the queue for the men's bathroom at the Cambridge Conference of Contemporary Poetry in about 1979, I think, and someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Are you a language poet?" And I turned around and I just muttered inaudibly. I couldn't think of what to say, so I was non-committal. And I realised afterwards that it may have been a pickup line, but I wasn't quick enough to respond to that. But also, I think as a bilingual working class man living in North Wales before I was involved in academia, language poetry was extremely important to me in helping me to think productively about relationships between languages, geographies, and cultural and political power. I'm not sure that when Charles Bernstein and Bruce Andrews were editing the Language Poetry magazine that I was kind of on their radar in terms of being an audience, but it certainly got to me anyway. So language poetry, for those of you who anyway, I'll just give a kind of brief summary. Language poetry focused on the politics and materiality of language, or words of words, and as they then said, the referent. Influenced by Stein, perhaps more than Pound, language poetry was both in conversation with and reaction to work from Black Mountain College, the so-called New York poets, and those that were called beats, and perhaps in a more direct lineation with the objectivists Zukowski, Niedecker, Reznikov, and Oppen, and their interest in the object of the poem. So poetry for the language poets was no longer primarily a means of self-expression, but a construction of language using tools such as parataxis and conjunction and disjunction, producing texts that required the active participation of the reader to construct meaning. So these were heady ideas in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and an opportunity to apply hard-won ideas about literary production and reception within poetic practice. They did, of course, simultaneously excite people and make people angry. Charles Bernstein, of course, has to bear some of that burden of language poetry, but his work, like the work of any writer, can only be partly explained by the context from which it emerges. So his latest collection, Near/Miss, and the backslash, of course, with the ampersand is one of those signs of avant-garde poetry, begins with a line by Rimbaud in French, then continues with the line, "This is a totally inaccessible poem." Each short line over the 13-page self-referential work is centered on the page, and the final line is, "It's unreal." If that sounds funny, it's supposed to be. Other poems in the collection are in blocks of prose or anaphoric lists. Other poems break the words across lines only half a word long, so you have to piece the poem together. It's also a collection that in its range deals with grief and loss and the language and explores different concepts of languages of prejudice. So my question is, and perhaps this is a question to start with, is this still language poetry? Should we read near/miss in the sense of a continuity of those concerns? Or have you left those far behind in the twists and turns of your poetry? Is it rather speaking to other contemporary poets for whom language poetry might be a distant memory?
Well, thanks so much. What a wonderful commentary. And you have the issues of the magazine, which are great. So this was the actual, what do you have? Well, a lot of them here. These were the pamphlet issues, and this is just, well, this was the 13th. So this was published 1978 to 1981. Since you have the material text here, it's hard not to talk about it for a second. And just in a couple, this summer, or in June, the University of New Mexico Press is publishing the first 13 issues, and maybe a couple of other things. It's based, but there was this other things associated, but basically these issues as a facsimile book that'll come out. Actually be quite expensive, I think, but maybe it's $90 in a cloth bound, but it's a nice item. But the original issues were for the first 6 issues $4, which if we update that to contemporary euros is what, 7 euros. I mean, 8 euros maybe for the 6 issues. This is extremely inexpensive. Postage was cheaper. And Susan B., who is sitting here, I'm sure does not want to be hailed. Nonetheless, she designed these for us, and we typed them on a Selectric typewriter. We sprayed the pages because at that time the ink would smear from the particular kind of self-correcting Selectric, and then she pasted them up for us on a old-fashioned paste-up table, and we did very little white space, trying to keep the things to under $500. This is an interesting one, the supplement number 2, June 1980, some recent British poetry magazines compiled by Chris Cheek. So this was one of the things about connecting. This is just a list of magazines that Chris was in touch with. There was no, of course, as you know, there was no other way to get this kind of information out with the addresses, who published in them, and this is something, you know, that we share also, this kind of, trying to get information about other publications out. It's funny, language is sometimes viewed as a small group of people, but actually there was never a core group. It was always very much trying to bring together disparate things, and so that it's hard to answer what it was in that sense. Of course, there were people that I was particularly close to, or a small group of people that were the editors and so on. There was another book that came out from the University of New Mexico Press also in the spring, which I was very happy to see. It was called Language Letters. So there were letters from Bruce Andrews, Ron Silliman, and me from 1972 to around 1978. It's a several hundred-page book, just a small sample of our letters. But mostly Bruce and Ron. I come in a little bit later, even though I was in touch with Bruce from with Ron from 73, because they're trying to trace the origins of the magazine. And there you see the kind of list making and sort of trying to figure things out of what was going on in the world. So, I mean, you say in your introduction, bringing people together, you know, and I think that is an impulse that I have. It's not just bringing anybody together. It's not deliberate. Why don't we all get along? Or why doesn't everybody in a particular place get along? Because in a lot of ways, the place where I live, which is a wonderful place, New York City, I lived all my life there, and most of the people that I'm interested in, engage with, don't live in New York and aren't interested in what I'm interested in. But for example, we live thousands of miles apart and share an interest. So I realized to bring people together had to do with bring people not where you were together not to neglect the people who were present in Dublin, as we'll have this wonderful reading tonight, and in general in the UK and Ireland, English-speaking countries. But New York, okay, but it wasn't really the primary thing. Most people would be outside of that. So it's bring people together in a constellation who didn't necessarily have any connection with one another that I saw, or we saw, Bruce and I, when we edited this, or in different contexts in Buffalo, just trying to create places for communication and exchange. So the places of communication and exchange is fundamental. There isn't really a core essence to what was being proposed, except a conversation that was aversive to or questioned shibboleths, that is to say, defining stylistic features of contemporary American poetry, especially. So people tell you, you gave a good summary, by the way, which I agree with. But even around the issue of voice, people say we're against voice, but of course, you read my writing, it's all filled with voice, but it's just puts them in different ways. So I always say I'm in favor of voices and voicing. The critique had to do with the mandate that voice had to be expressed or emotion had to be expressed in a particular way, not against affect, voices, or expression. Into the public was another term, and that's fascinating to me. And you're reminded me of a Frank O'Hara poem with this fly spot by the toilet, to pick up a line there. Just such an interesting moment in that. What public space, really, and this is what you meant, I'm just interpreting your own comment, but it's such an interesting moment of public-private that I like. Being hailed in the toilet, outside, and not knowing, is a pickup line. But I like the idea of a pickup line better than a school or a group. I like the idea that it might hail you into some exchange rather than that there's some pre-existing world that you're in, and that by becoming into it, you change what it is. So this is some older person now thinking back on these things from when I was in my 20s. I'm very adamant to note or to acknowledge that the idea of things like Language Magazine and otherwise were places to pull people in. They were not now. That never works, by the way, and there are always kinds of exclusions and preferences, prejudices, based on all the kind of typical words associated with that. But nonetheless, the hope was that it would be places that would be open and in public, but public-private, where people say, well, that's doing something different, that interests me, and that you would then become a part of it. So it was really more of a recruitment to something like communism than it was something that was pre-existing, or a school or a clique that you couldn't be a part of. Now, there are advantages I see to cliques now that I was more critical of at the time. There are a lot of reasons in American poetry that there are cliques. People know each other and their social world is defined by them. That was never my possibility. It was never, I hadn't have friends who could exactly be like that. But I certainly appreciate it in the poets of the generation older than me, different kind of social space. But at the time, I was sort of critical of that. Well, you say near miss the continuity. Is it still part? I mean, my own work is partly evolves through trying not to do the same thing I've done before, but realizing that the more I change, the more it's the same, like they say, that even if I do something in a completely different style, you still hear the same obsessive. They're kind of interesting because my basic range of interests are very, I think if you read my work, you can go back to my earliest, writing on when I was in college. I didn't go beyond college as a student, but I wrote about Stein and Wittgenstein. You can still see a lot of the interests in Stein and Wittgenstein that persist, but nonetheless, the world changes and the forms change. So to me, what happens is you're able to articulate those interests and who you are through different kinds of forms. So forms and styles is something that I'm not interested in finding one or repeating it. But I think my identity, my philosophical and aesthetic interests come out when they're challenged by constant changes. But then that issue of transition, of diaspora, of not exactly being at home in any place and not assuming I know who I am, but finding out, those are the conditions of my life as well as the poetics that interest me. So I think near miss is, certainly as you suggest in a subtle way, reflects the changes in life, things that happen to me. Nonetheless, the books aren't about those things, but nonetheless, they come out, and those, of course, not things that had happened to me earlier. So there's that, and then, I'm interested in constantly decentering who I am and what I'm interested in. You said at one point, I don't know how old you are, but I don't know how old you would have been in 1978. How old were you in 1978?
21.
Oh, 21. Oh, perfect. Yeah. Well, okay. We're thinking about you, but the whole point of language was we weren't thinking about anybody.
Yeah.
And, that's the idea, if it works. Now, I understand that there are real problems that it doesn't really work, and that you see the limitations and the exclusions that are marked in your own language and all the rest. Try to be as self-conscious about that as can be. But you can't be beyond, you can't be ahistorical, you can't leave your time or the particular moment. But the hope, again, the idea even, was that it would make possible for someone to read that and to think, that could be for me, just as we were those people. So, kind of continuity and discontinuity. And then, translations come a lot more in. And I've become more involved with poetry outside the U.S., which is not a surprise. Maybe it is a surprise. Not for me, because I started out, just really, I had gone to college, and I knew a group of poets, and I was, of course, obviously an obsessive reader and thinker. When I got my job at Buffalo, where you came many years later, I was about 40 when I got that job. I didn't have any academic job before that. So, and I've been 30 years, I was teaching in a PhD program, and that transformed my conception of what needed to be taught and what the significance was. But certainly, the insularity of the American poetry context, became very striking to me, and the obsession, not the obsession really, but the bloatedness on English and the English language, and especially American English, was very disturbing, especially as American culture is such a big export item. It's very easy to just float within English, even no matter what you say. So I became very engaged with trying to work outside of that and not make my frames of reference exclusively within that. And by doing translation or going places, meeting people, and responding to things outside of the U.S. context, as well as looking beyond context within the U.S. That I had grown up with and that had been significant to me, and seeing what is outside of that, up to a point that I could do it. And then with Buffalo, that becomes a whole different world, where you're actually teaching undergraduates, for example, or graduate students whose knowledge about poetry, at least in the U.S., at least among undergraduates, is almost zero. It's very close to zero. And in fact, I would say it's negative. If you can have negative knowledge, which you can, because a lot of the information that these are wonderful students at Buffalo and Penn, nothing to do with them, but the information that they come in with is often based on very problematic teaching in what we call K through 12 in the United States, so kindergarten through the end of high school. The information they have in English classes often gives them a completely unfortunate idea about what poetry is, and just kind of basically misleading. And so, from the point of view of potential readers of what I'm interested in, it would make those students find poetry would be entirely uninteresting, because it makes it seem dull, positive, or affirmative, rhyming, archaic, as opposed to television, popular music, movies, which are so dynamic, dark, fragmented, cacophonous. And then all of a sudden poetry is this other thing. So poetry actually could conceivably have led to the very things you like within the popular culture. But the disconnect is so great that it takes a lot of effort just to turn that around. And to do that, you don't really need to read the people that I read or the generation before. Or, you can deal with the history of poetry in a different way. So that therefore the kinds of lines and antagonisms that I'm committed to in a contemporary context don't make a whole lot of sense. I could mention a poet I think is given too much attention versus somebody else who's entirely neglected. Everybody comes, a lot of people come, but it's meaningless within an undergraduate context in which the students would have no knowledge of either or even concern with what was being put forward as dominant, because what was being put forward as dominant wasn't anything they read about or was concerned about. So they're completely outside of that discussion. That's kind of liberating. And yet you'd see certain patterns of preference and recognition along lines of legibility versus illegibility. It could talk about, things like that. So anyway, thanks for your introduction. I always say I can give my long answer or my short
There's going
answer.
to be some overlap between my questions and what Professor Davidson said. All right.
Well, for the one thing, this first question you're asking, I want to say how much I profoundly disagree with the premise.
I'm sure you will. No, I actually think you will. So,
So I'm already off to a
yeah,
good start.
all right, so the difficult poem,
The
right?
difficult
The
poem.
difficult poem is a topic that's always interests you, right? And which you placed at the center of poems like Thank You for Saying Thank You from Girly Man, right, in 2006. And more recently, Thank You for Saying You're Welcome. And of course, the essay collection, Attack of the Difficult Poems, right? I was teaching my students near Miss last week. Some of them are there, right? And actually, the person that asked this or that made this assertion is over there, right? Girl that usually doesn't like to talk, but so she said that I showed them their poems, and ironically they found it accessible and entertaining, right? Of course, I selected.
Can I quote you on that? Accessible and entertaining? That would be very good for my next book. I think that's a word.
So how do you see Professor Davidson mentioned this, right? How do you see the relation between the aphoristic and anaphoric poetry in your recent books and your more difficult poems, right? They are, of course, very different in the sort of experience that they offer, right? And one kind does not replace the other. But can we perhaps say, and this you're going to disagree, I'm sure.
I was waiting
we
for what I
perhaps
disagreed
say
with, because so
that
far
you were
found
having fun?
unobjectionable,
Okay, yeah.
or in fact, I appreciated all of the comments.
Can we perhaps say that, in a way, these easier poems sort of distill the difficulty of the harder ones? That they, let's say, provide a kind of more immediate philosophical fix? Is it an
I
exercise
really
in
find it hard to
distillation?
see why I would disagree with that last point, but I'm working to see.
You-
It seems a reasonable way to look at it. I don't have an answer to that, and I think it's an interesting question
Right.
as to what the relationship is, and I think that's an interesting way to put it. I don't know that I don't think about it myself that way, but you as a thoughtful reader. The Attack of the Difficult Poems, the title is like the invasion from Mars, the aliens. I think that there are so many different senses of what people mean by difficult, but I just emphasize that life is difficult, leave it as the short answer, and that the idea that poetry should not be difficult in that sense is silly, and it depends on what you mean by difficulty. What's difficult about poetry is what's difficult about life, and everyday life especially, in the ordinary. So the idea that somehow, this is what I'm saying about K through 12, the idea that poetry is all of a sudden going to be simple and say, I love you, you love me, let's hold hands and walk into the sunset, which, is the basis of a lot of my poems basically say that, but there's a lot of difficulty between each word, so you can get to that. So, to make it real, you might say, or unreal. So, the unreal to me is more real than the real, because the real is simulated, commodified often. So you push back against it to try to find out what's going on. So, Attack of Difficult Poems, the idea of difficulty is something that I use as something to parody. It's an object of satire, but it becomes interesting. And in the two poems you mentioned, this is a completely accessible poem. The problem I have with that poem, which is one that I like, of course, the poem emphasizes this. I sometimes read it like that. This is a completely accessible. Every word is dishonest. Is that? Of course, you understand what's going on, but the sarcasm, the point of view, who's speaking, it isn't so obvious even to me. And where I think that that poem, the difficulty of that poem for me as the writer is that it's much too close to being condescending than almost anything else that I've written. And I don't like that about it, and yet the poem sort of speaks its own logic. But that logic tends to have something that I don't like, which is associated in a way with the kind of Pound Eliot condescending form of high modernist difficulty. It's difficult because you're stupid, or you haven't had the education I have, you haven't read the Odyssey, or you don't know this reference to this stuff. All of these kind of idea that you don't know a reference, their class snobism is a simple way to put what that is. It's not really significant, I think, for either poet. If you read them, you got to read beyond it. But a lot of poets, of course, want to assert their class knowledge as if it makes them better. And of course, in retrospect now, it makes them seem worse, but it doesn't mean that the poetry's not interesting. You just have to dispense with these, poisonous ideas. I mean, bringing together different sources. You have the same in popular culture too. I always say the real elitism in America is mass culture, because if you don't have a certain level of mass popularity or sales, what you're doing is considered worthless, including, by the way, university humanities institutes, studying older literature. All of that, it doesn't have market value, so it's considered worthless. So I'm much more concerned about the way in which things that don't have market value are considered worthless. That's the real elitism to me. It doesn't mean that popular culture isn't great. It is, but if you speak, people in popular culture often say those things, that some things that don't, make the charts are not valuable. I mean, that's our current elitism. Doesn't mean that they're elitism, doesn't mean that they're great artists. I think that there are actually many great artists in popular culture who have that, who are deeply committed to mass audiences, and that's their worldview, and they produce great things. But also they can't produce the kinds of things that those of us involved with microculture and small audiences produce. So the issue of small and large to me, has to do with audiences, what people understand. People have a very range of different references that they get, and my work is filled with somebody who will, Marjorie Perloff, who's an old friend of mine, a wonderful, famous literary critic. She gets certain things in my work, but she'll always say she has no idea of many of the references in my work that have to do with American television in the 1950s. Now, for me, that is appalling, that people don't know American situation comedy in the 1950s. I forgive her because she was a refugee and probably didn't even have television at that time, but in general. But my work is indeed filled with things that you couldn't possibly know about unless you were in the cultural space that I'm in. So those are some of the difficult references. You can look them up. So I like that exchange of differences. I mean, that you could have a reference to a high literary source, but also to one that is personal, as well as to one that's in popular culture, and you have that exchange. So thank you for saying thank you. Because it's mocking this person who wants accessibility, unlike many of my other poems, it's not able to overcome the difference between the poet who's making fun of this idea of accessibility. And I think it is possible in many of my works to break down this reader-writer distinction and to throw myself into question more, which doesn't happen in that poem. That's why that poem was successful, and it works as a kind of a trap. I like stand-up comedy too and so on, but I have a limitation in general with that as well. So though I don't think that, I'm criticizing it just to note that it's in a spectrum, and it's in a book in which there are a lot of poems that are not like that. But in general, the kind of poems I prefer, which is true of the second one, thank you for saying you're welcome, this is a completely inaccessible poem, where the crazed, almost demonic attitude of the speaker becomes foregrounded, and you realize the person saying this is insane in some way. It destabilizes the very satiric position that it seemed to rely on in the beginning. So those poems might be more accessible at a certain level. That certainly it's another set of poems which in the last couple of books come out, which are I call radical legibility. And tonight I think I'll read mostly from Near Miss, in which it has the same sentence structure. So there's one that I'm not going to read tonight, I don't think, called The Lie of Art, which is...
Yeah, I had my kids
Okay,
read-
so I mean, you can't miss it. It's I don't like accessible art. I don't like inaccessible art. I don't like expressive art. I don't like sarcastic. It has just a set of terms. You can't really not follow the poem. You can, maybe you can wonder why I'm saying it, but you can't not follow it because the sentences are simple. In fact, it's coercive in its legibility. That's why I call it radical legibility, because you can't lose your place. You can't say, I missed the line, so the whole thread of the thing. There is no thread. It's just all these and I do that quite a lot. So that those radically legible poems still might be illegible within the context of what lyric poetry is, what expression is, how people think about or deal with ambiguity. So my war poem, which is one that I think is the opposite of this accessible poem, thank you for saying thank you, in that it does destabilize the position of the reader. So that's a poem that's called War Stories, that's in one of my earlier books. Maybe it's in Girly Man too, or maybe it's in Recalculating. I can't remember which book it's in. But it was done in 2003, that I remember, the year of the invasion of Iraq by the United States. And so that poem, which is war is, every line is war is, and justifies a war in different ways. So war is, violent, war is horrible, but also war is necessary to fight oppression, to give just to give the scheme. It has these two, more than two, but it tries to contrast ways in which people who are anti-war would support war. War is the right of people without power to fight against those in power. So that would speak to a different point of view than the patriot who feels we have to have war to defend our patrimony, right? Or the Marinetti, which I do quote Marinetti, war is beautiful, hygienic, famously from the Futurist Manifesto. So there are multiple things with the avant-garde. But so that poem is fundamentally, has multiple points of view that can't be reconciled, in my view. And it really, I think, does succeed if it succeeds at all, but I think it does, in really being irreconcilable. You can't say what it is. However, I would maintain that there's no question that in 2003, when I published that, and I think it must be in Girly Man, because it's from that same period, because Girly Man itself is a poem against the Iraq War, that it's clearly an anti-Iraq war poem. I don't think I can't imagine somebody reading it that wouldn't realize, especially in the light of 2003, that it was against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. So that's a difficult point. But nonetheless, there was a so-called liberal publication called the Boston Review that published an attack on that poem and compared it to a neo-fascist right-wing talk show host whose name happily slips my mind, but is still around, one of these kind of hyper Fox News sort of people. And I was shocked by this, also talking about Arkady Dragomashenko and saying that because I didn't have a clear position that was empathetic to the victims of war, although there's plenty of statements in it that are, that it was, I don't know how, I can't even imagine how this person thought it could be like a right-wing neo-fascist radio guy, but they did. But the point was, because ambiguity itself had to be deplored. Why it had to be deplored as neo-fascist, I don't know, but that's a scary thing to me. So their question of accessibility becomes complicated, as you have to make clear what your position is. You can't have ethical ambiguity. The ambiguity itself, and I suffer from this. Most people who dislike what I do dislike it because it doesn't have a clear moral message. That's that, and it's the ambiguity of the position, or really the anti-moral aspect that's against fixed ideas of morality. Much like William Blake, by the way, not a shocking view for poets, but nonetheless, they probably wouldn't have liked William Blake either. So then this is the level of certain kind of accessibility. All these things are really not so accessible as they seem. So the accessible is not, but to me it's important to have a oscillation between different levels of textual surfaces, some of which appear to have hooks that you can understand, and some of which operate within the space of opacity, which I'm also interested in, which having syntax where you have syntax that isn't declarative sentences, where you have levels of juxtaposition that are not like war is this, war is that, but war is a mountain in China that I've never visited. The floor seems very dusty today. Kind of juxtaposition where it's not the same frame. It's constantly shifting.
Let me just interrupt you to say that when I was making that claim, right, about like these poems being distillations of those more difficult ones, right? I was thinking about the aphorisms, for example, at the end of pitch poetry.
Right. There's a number of works of mine that are aphoristic.
Right.
So the aphorisms. I mean, I love aphorisms. And there's and the history of aphorisms. That's a different strain. The aphorisms probably are, but all my aphorisms are usually demented. That is to say, they may sound like they're sensible aphorisms, but I always substitute one word for another. So my answer is, yes, you're right. There's just a spectrum of different experiences, and I want work to move you through radically incommensurable spaces, even from one poem to the other. But that the so-called inaccessible poems with difficult syntax or odd juxtapositions are actually probably a lot more accessible once you accept the premise that they are not working within conventional representational space, and you can experience them and you move through them. And the accessible ones are actually much more barbed than they appear to be. The other thing about the so-called inaccessible, a lot of what I do is something I'm interested in talking about more lately. Well, a lot of what I do is to reverse things. I take what an expected word and I use the opposite word, or I reverse the order of a sentence. The sentence I reverse the order I reverse I the order. Perverse the order of the wentence. So there's this constant reformation, and that's something that actually has to do with my own perceptual experience as what I call a kind of cognitively dyslexic or spatially dyslexic. I can read without a problem, and I can write also, but I do invert letters, and I also confuse left and right spatially all the time. I always go in the wrong direction. But also I hear reverse things. Even when I see a sign, I will reverse so even when I see that 5, I also see, that it's 11. I just see the opposite. I'm not trying to. I just do see the flip. And actually, I often see the flip the first time, which is odd, I know, but certainly it's the reason why I would almost always go right when I should go left. It's not like I sometimes make it. I almost always see it the right. What seems to me the way to go is almost always reversed. So I always think that west is east. So that's my experience, and I realize that in some ways the so-called opacity and reversal in my work is based on a particular cognitive relation to the world, and that a lot of people actually have that too. So when people see that, I have a poem that also people I call defensive poetry, which is all typographical errors. That's sometimes used in composition classes because students see it, or people read it and they say, oh, I make that same error, the same spelling, and perhaps I invert the H and the A. Because a lot of people do it. And they see, they recognize the mistakes because they're constantly being criticized for making those exact mistakes. And so those people in a group can see that, and also that I'm making poetry of the sound and revealing the mistakes. They don't find that inaccessible. That actually immediately speaks to, but somebody else who always spells correctly and who wouldn't recognize those errors, it seems like nonsensical. Why are you flipping them around? So it's an interesting area in which sometimes local perceptual as well as cultural experiences are opaque to those who don't have those experiences. But that's what cultural difference is, and celebrating cultural difference would be to allow poetry a space where things are not the same, because people can then read across the way they are to the way other people are. And I mean that to extend beyond the particular practice I have to a whole range of different poetry which we read across our own experiences, but that the differences are what's expressed in the poem, not the more liberal idea that we're all humanity, we're all the same people, we all have the same experiences, and the poem expresses that with some not with some, but with some fundamental recognition that people sometimes don't see us the same, but that we are the same. Something I fundamentally agree with within democratic social space. The rule of law, people must be treated the same, regardless of what their experiences are. But in poetry, it's interesting to hear, not that we're all the same and may look different or sound different, but that actually we're all different. And the nature of what those micro differences are interests me very much, what João calls infra-thin differences. That's just your first question,
Yeah,
right?
that was my opinion.
So let me just go through the rest. The first one, yes. Second
No,
one,
you're
yes.
gonna-
The
you're
third
gonna
one, no. And the fourth one, maybe. Just to
I'm actually going to
summarize.
skip this one because I think you've already answered it. And I'm going to jump right into this, which is also about difficulty and accessibility. Right, so is it fair to say, right?
No. If it's fair,
hold
why
on,
would you say it?
just- Is it fair to say that poems like, say, Rob Fitterman's This Window Makes Me Feel, or Vanessa Place's Rape Jokes, right, or any of her other projects, right, despite their apparent accessibility, are in fact more difficult than a recent poem, let's say, by Lena Ginian or Bruce Andrews, right? Students resist seeing these poems as poems, right? Many times, right? At least it's my experience that people, and critics also, right? A number of people say that they offer nothing new, right? That they're just gimmicky, right? Or benefiting from like hype, right? Are they, do you think, difficult, right? In a way. Because of the context.
Vanessa Place is sure difficult. I don't know to what degree you know the works that João was talking about. Vanessa Place is very extreme, and there's a kind of masochism about the way in which she puts her work forward. That's the objection of the possible response is so extreme. So, I mean, and they're dealing with often extremely difficult circumstance, like statements of not the people who are sexually abused, but by her clients, which are the people who are the perpetrators of the sexual abuse, who themselves, in another context, are often the victims of sexual abuse, but who are themselves also abusers. And she defends such people in court as a lawyer. I mean, even to give those set of sentences is difficult for me to do without falling into the trap of sounding like, even in reporting it, I'm not deeply concerned about the people who are scarred and destroyed for their lives by that kind of abuse. And I wouldn't do that. It's too hot for me to handle. That's what I would say about that. I couldn't possibly deal with the kind of material that Vanessa Place deals with. I mean, and furthermore, here's something I said to my friend Eileen Miles. She's always asked to talk about certain questions. I said, nobody asks me what I think about those questions. And I'm glad. Nobody wants to know what I think about those questions. And I think they're right not to know. I am not the right person to contribute to those questions. And I see the limitations of that. So I would say she gets herself into hot water because she manufactures the hot water and she jumps into it, and that creates certain kinds of difficulties. They are not the kinds of difficulties that I'm dealing with or would want to, but beyond that could deal with, is really outside of the realm of what I would feel capable of, aesthetically capable of. It's just
a sense that the answer is, the response is built in, isn't it?
what?
There's a sense that the response is built
In her work.
Yes. That by doing it, I mean, the response is already anticipated in the production of the work.
Right, although, yes, of repulsion, perhaps. I mean, like the rape jokes. I mean, it's, I grew up in a context of feminism. Susan and many of the people from when I was, a teenager, and I was surrounded by and by people who noted that lots of my style of speaking and even way of thinking and references were marred by a history of certain kind of male being in the world. And I certainly haven't overcome that, but I'm just aware of it, that's what I like to say. Sometimes I have moments of consciousness. So, so for me, that issue of rape jokes, I mean, if you look through my work, you'd see that I really stay away from things even that could be misinterpreted in that way. If I were to make jokes, they would be Jewish jokes, say, or jokes that are more about myself, or I like to make jokes about, men, in fact, which I find are a wonderful source of mockery and satisfies me entirely as a field. So I'm just saying, Vanessa comes into the poetry world, especially also as a lesbian as well, and she's doing something that she can do or can't do. It may be she's doing something you can't do. That would be an interesting way to look at it too. And a lot of people are very offended by what she does. So I think it's partly people do what they can do as poets, and what they can offer that somebody else hasn't done. I know that's a hard thing for people outside of poetry to understand. Sometimes you do what you're able to do because there's a space to do it that nobody else can do, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that extremity in what a poet does. I do what I do because, in a way, I can do it, and I'm not interested in effacing my individuality or my, the aesthetic signature of what I do at all. That's another kind of strange misunderstanding. In fact, I think that so much poetry that claims to be personal is very bland, and anybody can do it. So. But I agree with the concept, basically, that difficulty is a range of different things, and people make life difficult for themselves. As a person in the world, and as a teacher, and as a citizen, and as a poet and an editor, I have a really hard time with certain kinds of volatile, expletive-ridden language, or language that's completely marred in social positions that I detest. Making fun of somebody who wants accessible poems, I'm already saying that's too much for me. So in a way, I'm a wimp. I'm very cautious about that. I don't even in the generation before me, I almost never use. I almost have no explicit material in my work, and that's the way I want it. That's not something that I'm interested in, or that I can, and another way to say it is maybe I just can't figure out how to work with material like that. I certainly admire the generation older than me for breaking a lot of the barriers around sex and taboo language, but it isn't something that, I'm not interested in taboos, let's put it that way, in that way. It's just, it doesn't have to do with the kind of experience that I want when I'm writing, and what aesthetics allows for me. The difficulty in the aesthetic space that I like is quite a different one, and actually avoids explicit taboos of that kind, because that tends to fixate on just the taboo. But I'm not interested in those kinds of cathected moments of transgression or taboo at all, actually. I'm interested in creating a poetry that doesn't have that, but rather has a much more permeable space, which doesn't. Because in a way, I'm not so much interested in those kind of cathected moments. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question.
But we'll move on to something completely different. Right. So, since at least Apoetics in the 90s, you've presented yourself as a Groucho Marxist.
Uh-huh.
Normally, what people ask
that was
you
my
to,
move from my many years as a Harpo-Marxist.
Yeah, I was considering.
I
considered asking you about Chico and Harpo. Right? But anyway, normally, what people ask you to clarify, right, is your poetry's relation to the Marx brothers, right, or to Groucho in particular, right? But I'd like you to do the opposite in today, and ask you what your relation to Marxism is,
Yeah.
now that red baiting is not as much as an issue as it was when you started writing. In this context, we can, of course, reference how now Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have made democratic socialism mainstream, right? Or perhaps even more radically, how people like Mark Fisher or Julie Dean have tried to rehabilitate the concept of communism, right? So as a leftist, right, what would you...
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's a funny reversal in a way. Well, I mean, my joke about, I think one of my, in the comedy essay, Comedy in the Politics of Reform, I say I speak of the four Williams, Raymond Williams, Tennessee Williams, William Carlos Williams, and Esther Williams. Esther Williams it's in a way a problematic addition to that, but she's somebody who was a swimmer in 1930s films, and so it was kind of the pageantry of swimming, and the three Marxes, Groucho. Four.
There's the other
Four,
boring
right.
brother, right?
Right. Well, no, they're not just the Marx brothers, but Carl and Groucho. But Carl and Groucho are both Jewish for one thing, and I would think that there's something about Spinoza that interests me very much within. I'm really interested in what T.S. Eliot calls the tradition of free-thinking Jews. As you remember from the Sacred Woods, he didn't like it. He thought that free-thinking Jews were the problem, and I'm hoping that that's true in my work. That non-religious Jewish culture, and as a culture of the midrashic, of questioning and of commentary, and of close attention to verbal slippage, and is something I feel connected to. And Karl Marx, is reading Capital, really. He's reading the economic system as if it's a text. I mean, Spinoza, of course, is reading the world as if it's a text rather than controlled by God, something that obviously Marx. And I think that this is also true of Jewish comedy, which is diasporic comedy, especially in the Marx brothers, not just the Marx brothers, but there's a whole range of comedians that I like, American comedians of that generation of my parents, who are slipping on the banana of assimilation in American culture. So this doesn't answer your question about what I think about. I don't really know what it means in an easy way. I don't think that Bernie Sanders comes off as a Marxist within the U.S. context. I think comes off as a democratic socialist. And I think in the American context, a democratic socialist is really just a left liberal. And I'm all for it, I will tell you my Bernie Sanders joke, since it's just between us and also being recorded. Although I did actually, the thing about Bernie Sanders, I'm really glad you asked me about him, because he's from Brooklyn, where I'm now living. And this, I think, I'm very happy to talk about this here in Ireland, because, you people in Ireland, it's a wonderful thing. I love hearing the accent that you have. It's a beautiful thing. And I feel the same in England, in London. Everybody's speaking with an accent. And in America, all of our politicians, the present ones, all the people except Bernie Sanders, and all the previous presidents, they all have accents. Bernie Sanders is the only person to run for president who has no accent. He speaks with such a bell-like voice. It's like the King's English to me. So is that the Marxism you're asking for? I can say to you for sure, my politics is that we have a grotesque transfer of money from the many, the people who produce it, to the few, and that in my lifetime it's gotten worse, not better. It was in the 60s when we protested, the distribution wasn't as bad, and that a lot of the stuff that goes on with Trump is just sand in the eyes to distract us against the transfer of wealth, and that's why you see the Republicans stick by him, because what they're basically, they're like the mob. They're like a criminal organization, the Republican Party, or a terrorist organization, and their terrorism has to do with making sure that money is taken from the many and is in the hands of the rich offshore if possible and untouchable. And in the course of that, they're willing to destroy the earth and the environment that we live in because they are a criminal terrorist group, just like the people who went into the tower on 9/11, destroying their own lives and the 3,000 people in that building. They don't care about those values. They're willing to destroy the whole planet for their intrinsic belief that the money is theirs and that they can collect it and hold on to it. Does that make me a Marxist, or does that just make me an American citizen who's concerned?
No, let me just maybe ask something else about that. Right? Like my question was more: do you feel that the left is undergoing in the States, especially, right, is undergoing some sort of revival, right, or going back to values that maybe were rejected with?
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, I don't mind. I mean, I think about that, and these are questions that I don't feel I have any particular way of answering that many other people wouldn't. So there's nothing about what I do, but that it does interest me to say. There's nothing about what I do that gives me any better ability to answer that question. It is true that someone like me would never be asked that question on the BBC or American. In fact, I would say something else about that. I wrote in Near Miss a poem that was commissioned by National Public Radio, which is like our BBC, called Our United Fates. They even paid me $500, which is quite a lot of money for it, but they wouldn't broadcast it. Girly Man, that poem that was the anti-war, I couldn't get published in any mainstream publication. So I think you have, on the part of the liberal media, like the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, National Public Radio, complete exclusion of any kind of turbulent thought that questions. For example, even my comment here, put in that way, could not be broadcast. Nobody says anything like that. Even the op-ed, even Krugman will not say that. So I think the problem is the rhetoric. Is the rhetoric better? I don't know. I think that there's a lot of bland rhetoric that speaks in bland ways about issues that I care about. I don't think it's that the activists are a problem. I think the activists are excluded from that conversation and the mainstream press, which one of the interesting things that Trump does is to attack the mainstream press, so that it makes it difficult to note that the mainstream press is very conservative, because he's saying that they're socialists and leftists, but actually it's a very effective strategy, because if he's saying the lying liberal media, then you can't say the mainstream press has a problem. But I think the mainstream press was partly responsible for Trump getting elected. You couldn't, and I have a piece in Jacket 2 where I quote the head of National Public Radio, which is again kind of like the BBC, says that we will not call Trump's lies because we don't know what his intention is. I mean, so that basically means that you can have Fox News calling, you know, anybody who's not a hard right person a liar, but that the mainstream media will not respond, will not note the kind of lying. And, you know, every time Trump says one of his things that he says, it should be noted that he accused these young black boys who were convicted of the Central Park rape, that he said that they should be killed, and they were innocent. It should just, every time it should say, Trump, the man who accused young black men and said that they should be killed, who turned out to be innocent. Trump, who accused Obama of the birther. I mean, every time, that's what should be emphasized. You should repeat those lies, not just say it's questionable what he's saying. That the person saying it has the history of making these kinds of comments. Otherwise, when you just repeat it the way it is, it just reinforces it. So I think I have a real hard time with the concept of progress. I always have, and it's maybe generational. I hope it's not an okay boomer moment, but I think 68 we were a very small militant group who were against the war, and for civil rights and feminists and so on, and there's been an enormous movement toward some rights, gender equality certainly for gay people, not where we'd like to see it be, but certainly better than it was in 68. There has been, and civil rights to some degree, not where we'd like to, and so on, but not in terms of distribution of wealth though, but those issues. So I don't know about progress. I think that if you're young, you find the world intolerable. I do and would. where you are. I don't know what sense it makes to compare it to 68 or not. It was a very different time. We were in the Vietnam War. We got out of it, and then we were back in the Iraq War. I don't, the devastation of what happened there and in the Middle East is still with the people there. What's happened to Iraq now? Is there a greater opposition to stuff like that? I don't know. I hope so. I think the point isn't, I don't have any ability to quantify it. I live in Brooklyn. The people I know have attitudes very similar to mine. I don't really I don't know what the people here think, but I suspect that there probably aren't a whole lot of people here who have views such as the people who are supporting Donald Trump. So I don't know what goes on in the U.S. I don't have any better way of knowing it than when I read The Guardian, the Washington Post, the New York Times. I don't have any better way of assessing it than that. I know what I think. I know what my friends think. I also know what's going on, and I can explain it. I also, have an idea of what I can do as a poet. But that's one of the reasons about public. A lot of my friends have given up on the idea that poetry should be in a public space or that it matters what's reviewed in the TLS or the Times. But I do think it matters, and I do think that those publications should be held to account for their exclusion. And it's much worse in the UK. I mean, I'm reviewed in the TLS happily, but almost none of the poets in Ireland or the UK that I care about, they're completely and mercilessly excluded from that attention. Now, many of them, maybe I hope they don't suffer from it every day or at all, but it's a real problem because it doesn't allow other kinds of oppositional views. So when I read the poems in those publications that I just mentioned, when they publish them, I mean, they're absurd. It makes poetry into a joke. Well, there are poets of all kinds right now writing marvelous things of different types. It should be published. It should be part of that discussion. And that's what I can talk to you about, whether in a macro-political way, especially given what's going on with global warming, which wasn't the case in this, irreversible. I mean, when you have irreversible global warming, it's hard to honestly be optimistic. But I'm Gramsci, optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, and do the best we can. Certainly there's been enormous positive changes within the issues that I mentioned before, which are crucial and welcome and necessary. And they will allow for whatever change takes place, because you bring more people into the discussion that were excluded systematically. You take that thinking of those people who are excluded systematically more seriously, that will change, has to change. And that's a crucial thing. That the discussion, even in poetry, has opened up to include many more different kinds of people than earlier. That does change, and that's necessary. Whether it's enough to change, these kind of, double shifts of capital and climate, I don't know. I won't be around to see it.
I will shut up now and maybe because we're running out of time, and I'm gonna.
It's true. That's the point. We're always running out
I know.
of time. That's it.
So
It's a crisis.
I'll ask people in the audience to maybe ask Charles some questions.
Or do you have the same freedoms in the United States?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. The emphaticness was a rhetorical thing, actually. I just wanted to emphasize what a kind of to be as emphatic as could possibly be and an inflammatory as it could possibly be within the rhetoric of this discussion and so on, just to sort of respond to what you're saying and to speak in that way. I wouldn't say it was exaggerated. Actually, it was, if anything, understated, but the language was exaggerated. It was polemical, and I'm interested in that within the overall context of what I'm saying, so you can hear these different levels. But yes, it doesn't really matter at all what I say. It's irrelevant. I'm completely marginalized with it, even though I do very well. I had a wonderful job. My students get, but basically, freedom of speech for me works in such a way that I could scream all day long. There's no limitation on what I have to say. Very obvious in China. I've been in China a lot. There, it's every possible nuance is scrutinized. It's a totalitarian place. I very much believe in freedom of speech and depend upon it. But I do agree with those people, and it has to do with the kind of okay boomer criticism of my generation, which puts free speech above it. There are many ways in which freedom of speech is just a safety valve. You can let off steam, and then the stuff goes on, and that everybody's speech, of course, the right-wing speech is also protected. I don't agree with the idea that you should in any way limit freedom of speech because of that, but I hear the problem that people experience because there's no place, especially within, there's no place for, it just doesn't, it's able to be heard effectively within, it's almost like frequencies of sound. It's able to be heard to the people who already are hearing it, but it's very hard to move outside of that. So, no, there's no limitation on. And the fact that I'm here, actually in this classroom with the two of us, a guy from Portugal via Buffalo, where I taught, who's now here in Dublin, I don't know. This is my home. This is where there's no difference for me speaking here than anywhere else. This is entirely different than almost any other place. In other words, this is what I mean by this is the world that I exist in. And I don't even know you, but I'm just looking at you and assuming that you come here. And that I can say what I like. But how this world and this thinking can be moved to a public outside of it so that somebody, a 21-year-old, gets some glimpse of it and says, aha, there is another way of talking about those things. Because I do think, I'm really a big believer in George Lakoff's metaphors we live by. I think that the metaphors that we use in political discussion, which is the poetics issue. The Lakoff book is actually moral politics that's important in this respect, where he makes this argument, are crucial. The problem often with the Democratic Party, and although a lot of them are listening to Lakoff, and actually Pete Buttigieg is very much of a Lakoffian candidate. The problem with often with liberal critique is that it's very policy oriented. You may agree with the policy, like, should you have a single payer? Should people be allowed to have private insurance? What kind of people? Where would be the cutoff? All of that, from a Lakoffian point of view, is a waste of time because you're dealing with micro policy issues. What you need to talk about, as the right does, are values or the metaphors that you're existing within. So everything I did in my polemic was about the metaphors. The metaphor of Donald Trump as somebody who's happy to murder young black people without adequate trial, complains about his not getting a fair hearing. That should always be put in front. You have to control the metaphors. You can't allow to just respond to the metaphors that are being given. And Lakoff's point about this is don't think of an elephant. The minute you say an elephant, you can't say don't think of the elephant because you put the elephant in. The minute you repeat something that Trump says, it doesn't matter if you say you're against it, you're just repeating it. And so for me, the important thing is to develop metaphors and ways of thinking that emphasize. That's why, I very much liked Occupy Wall Street, the 1%. I thought that was one of the better articulations of what the issue was. 1% is simple, it's accurate, it's actually generous because it's 0.1 of 1%, but nonetheless. And the Occupying Wall Street and the people sitting there, and I even liked the leaderless aspect that was mercilessly criticized because I think that also metaphorically made the point that it wasn't about somebody making a speech. So those are the kinds of metaphoric thinking that I think can develop. And of course, you have huge issues in Ireland, especially in the UK, in Europe, this kind of rise of right-wing populism. I don't think the issue is people being able to say things that they want in Western Europe and the United States and Canada in the spaces that we're afforded, such as this. I think the difficulty is having some of that work and thinking leak into the larger culture, and the way in which people who would ostensibly agree will exclude things based on the kind of rhetoric that is used, just as on the concept of whether it's accessible or not. So my work can't be published for two reasons in the mainstream. It's not accessible and it's excessive in the rhetoric when it is accessible. So those two things is like the 1-2 punch. It basically paralyzes an enormous kind of cultural response to what's going on. But so it is a kind of self-censorship on the part of people who think that they're morally doing the right thing. They feel that they're on the right side of morality and objectivity because they accept a debilitating and self-lacerating conception of morality as a fixed thing and accessibility as also a kind of a given. All right, so now this really is the three lectures that I would give, each of which would be a couple of hours to answer that. And I have written about this quite a lot. But no, I would say that it's a problem within modernism that is crucial to think about, which has to do with cultural supremacism and hierarchy that's fundamental to that work. Doesn't mean the work isn't significant, but that the selection of things that are better than the other created a hierarchy within the selection mechanism, and that there was no critique of why those things were considered to be. And there was a kind of pan-culturalism that I could pick things from the different cultures and select that was the best, which I think is, doesn't allow for the development of a democratic social space within collage. So the one way I put it in one of my essays is that they practice montage rather than collage. Collage puts things together but doesn't establish a hierarchical relation with. Montage puts them together, but you're supposed to. That's why you're supposed to see what the meaning is. So when Pound says, I couldn't make it cohere, that's something to celebrate, whereas he is ambivalent about it. And I do think it's intrinsic to their anti-Semitism, by the way. I think that it's basic to what anti-Semitism is in both their cases. So, because Jews had no right to the culture that they were appropriating, as Pound says repeatedly, and as Eliot says in the Sacred Woods. But I don't think that means that The Wasteland isn't a great poem, or that the Cantos isn't fundamental. But I think it's important to keep the totalitarian and supremacist views in mind and to question those claims while recognizing the potential for collage and a more democratic aesthetic space within the techniques. And in both cases, their techniques way exceeded their reactionary political frames, at least later in their life. It's not clear that either of them had those views earlier. And I don't mean to make the two the same. They're not the same. They have different views. But I think that the dominance of those views in terms of the selection mechanism of what's significant and so on, still negatively affects the cultural reception of poetry now, and also causes some people to reject the whole modernism. So being associated, but I think the issues are fundamental. How you deal, the issue of collage, let's put it this way, the issue of multiculturalism, how to deal with different contrasting cultures, like in New York, where there are hundreds of different languages, people from all, how you deal with those, how you can put them together or not put them together, doesn't go away. It's a fundamental issue for poets and others to think about. The early work on that in the 20th century is also fundamental because at least you're dealing with those questions, but they're being dealt with in the exactly wrong way, and toward totalization shouldn't be surprising given the history of the 20th century. But so it's important to study and think about those works from the point of view of the Second World War especially, the systematic extermination of the European Jews, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These two twin things, which I grew up just a few years after, are, give us pause. My generation, for me, that's what I think about. That's where I come into the picture. What's wrong with this picture? It's not the Enlightenment isn't wrong. I'm for the Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment, can't be techno-rationality. It's not about rationality. So one has to look at that history, which I feel a part of. I feel very much a part of Western high culture. That's what I look at and I see, and it's always a mixed legacy, isn't it? And it's that kind of thinking that I think is crucial for poets and for poetry. Does that answer your question? Because it is a difficult and long answer. Marcia Perloff gave a wonderful talk at the MLA a couple of years ago in which she, talking about Pound's descendants, is so interesting. This Jewish survivor from Austria at the MLA, former president of the Academic Association. And who does she say? And we're near to where I grew up, a half a mile from where I grew up. And she's saying that I am descendant to pound, the main, for her, if she was to single somebody out, and she doesn't say it with any irony. She just says because of my interest in collage, multiple voices, she sees the technique, even though I would put forward Stein, my work is more like Pound. It's a long talk, but this is what she says. But I love the fact that she was saying it. What did it mean for her, though she would not accept this identity politics of it, but for this Jewish survivor to pick me out, because then she's got the last word, the last laugh, right? You know, she's the adult in the room. She's thoughtful, and she's not going to be baited by Pound into dismissing his work. And I admire that. I'm not going to be baited by somebody wants to say those things. I hear it, I don't like it, but I'm not going to be baited to say it's worthless. I'm not going to get into, that's not the point. That you're saying that, and I'm going to, I'm going to say, aha, this is the mistake. This is the mistake that your great work, magnificent, but this is a problem that is not able to be abided, and that's the way I think, that's the way I want to deal with the culture that I come into, and I couldn't do exactly what Marjorie did without, for me that's almost would be a comic mode to do that, but she's absolutely, that's what she thinks, but she's still showing this something that's refuses to be pulled down to that level, and that's great to me. Yeah. Yeah. I think that this is a really great question, and I can't answer it in a simple way, but I love that story. I found in my own experience, I always teach Pound, that he's I would say the most difficult in Buffalo, but also at Penn for undergraduates. And I don't even teach, I teach the earlier stuff, which is very sarcastic, and well, the politics are good, like Moore's Contemporary, the kind of satires of the rich. It's very, very difficult. You've got to spend a lot of time on it. So my experience is really trying to do it. That's like, it's a non-starter. It's just, you just can't get there with that. I think it all has to do with constellation. I don't think it matters which poem. I think you should teach multiple contradictory things that are meaningful to you as the teacher, that you care about. I think it's really great to use sound files so you hear poets reading. And I would always emphasize at least two things that have opposite values. To emphasize, to bring out the fact that there isn't like one way to do it. So, or better two, I should say, three things. So I can't give one thing. I have all my syllabi online, so you can see at the level, I came into teaching college students, but I do have comprehensive things about 19th century American poetry not from the US, from the 20th century, so global, and then multiple increments of American poetry in the 20th century. And you see how many multiple and conflicting things, even in a given week, I like to have things that conflict and ask questions about the different kinds of values that come up in the different sort of, social relations and so on. But in fact, because you're asking, I'm saying about one of the most intoxicating and appealing poets is Eliot, especially Prufrock. It's a wonderful poem, but my experience with undergraduates is that they love that poem. So it's that's an easy song, but I certainly wouldn't start with that poem because wouldn't be what I'm interested in doing. So I won't answer with any single question, but also you could deal with contemporary older stuff. I think one of the things I realized when I taught is it didn't really matter so much what poet I liked or what poems versus something else, that it was more basically dealing with reading values and giving things that created different problems for reading and talking about that and hearing how different people relate, and that you could do that with an enormous range of different things. Translation for American students, they really freak out when you have them read a poem in a different language. It's like they say, well, I'm not really experiencing the real thing. I think you really think you're experiencing the real thing when you're talking to me now. I don't say that, but I almost would be, now that I'm retired, I can say that the idea that this somehow, I understand the argument about it, but of course it just means that if you don't ever, you feel you can read history and philosophy and other languages, but you're not going to read poets who didn't write in English because it's in translation and so on, as if translation was somehow something different than when we read older things and so on. So I do think if I moved ahead now, I'd emphasize confronting the phobia of things not in your own, because it's accessibility, not in your own immediate bubble of understanding and language. And there are infinite number of things you could do with that, just bring in something that's foreign to some degree in your own language or another language. So I think now we are at 6 o'clock, and you want to stop?
Okay.
Well,
Thank
it's a
you.
pleasure to talk to you, and onward.